On a flight that was supposed to be just the start of an adventure for a 12-year-old boy, an act of prejudice turns the trip into an unforgettable lesson. After being unjustly ejected from the aircraft by a stewardess, the boy finds support in his father, who also owns the airline. With courage and dignity, they face the situation, showing that respect is non-negotiable and that even the most serious mistakes can become learning opportunities. A story of overcoming, empathy, and transformation. It was a morning that promised to be unforgettable. A black boy of just 12, his eyes shining with anticipation, was walking down the airport corridor with a simple backpack but loaded with dreams. He was about to board his first solo flight, a milestone of independence that any child his age would see as an adventure. As he entered the aircraft, he carefully chose a seat near the window, the perfect place to watch the sky and imagine the infinite possibilities that life could offer. But the world isn't always as welcoming as it should be. As he settled in, something in the air seemed to change. A stewardess, with a look that mixed suspicion and superiority, was watching him as if he were a piece out of place. It wasn't just a look. It was a silent judgment that spoke louder than any words. Perhaps she was trapped in prejudices she didn't even know she carried, but there she was, unable to see beyond the color of the boy's skin and the simplicity of his backpack. And how often in life are we not judged by appearances or circumstances beyond our control? The boy, however, didn't notice the suspicious looks right away. He was too busy admiring the plane's wings and imagining what it would be like to fly above the clouds. But the tension began to build around him, like a silent storm about to form. That moment of innocence and excitement was about to be abruptly interrupted, making it clear that not all journeys begin the way we expect. The boy's tranquility was interrupted when the stewardess approached with firm steps and an expression that left no room for politeness. She harshly asked him if he knew where he was sitting and demanded to see his ticket. Her tone was cold, almost as if she was dealing with someone who didn't belong there. The boy, still confused, handed over the ticket without hesitation, trying to understand what he had done wrong. After all, he was just in the seat he had chosen, ready to go on his adventure. Even after confirming that the ticket was correct, the stewardess remained suspicious. It was as if something in her couldn't accept the boy's simplicity in that environment. Perhaps it was the worn backpack or the fact that he was alone, but none of this justified her attitude. How many times in life are we put to the test by people who project their own prejudices onto us? Situations like this teach us that the problem is not always who we are, but how others see us. The boy, for his part, remained silent, but his eyes began to lose their sparkle of enthusiasm. He didn't understand why his presence seemed to bother him so much. Meanwhile, the other passengers began to notice the scene, some exchanging curious glances and others frowning in disapproval. It was clear that it wasn't going to end there. There was something in the air that indicated that this story had only just begun. Even after the supervisor confirmed that everything was in order with the boy's ticket, the stewardess seemed unable to accept the fact. She insisted, with a stubbornness that bordered on the absurd, that he shouldn't be there. Her arguments were empty, but loaded with a conviction that revealed something deeper, a deep-rooted prejudice that she perhaps couldn't even name. With every word she said, the atmosphere grew heavier and the passengers' gazes became more attentive. It was like watching a mistake being made in slow motion without being able to intervene. The boy, on the other hand, was beginning to feel the weight of the situation. He clutched his backpack tightly, as if it were his only safe haven amid the storm of stares and harsh words. It wasn't just discomfort. It was the feeling of being treated as someone invisible or unwanted. How many times in life are we put in situations where we feel like this? And worse still, how often do we allow this to make us doubt our own worth? Meanwhile, the other passengers began to react. Some whispered among themselves, indignant at the stewardess' attitude, while others just watched in silence, not knowing how to act. The tension grew like a rope about to snap. It was clear that something needed to happen to break the cycle of injustice and bring a greater truth to light. But who would have the courage to take the next step? Determined to end the situation in her own way, the stewardess made a decision that would shock everyone. With an authoritarian stance and cutting words, she ordered the boy to leave the plane. He slowly stood up, holding his backpack like a shield. His eyes were watery, but he didn't let the tears flow. He walked down the aisle under the perplexed and indignant gazes of the passengers, carrying not only his backpack, but also the weight of a humiliation he would never forget. The scene was painful to watch. Some passengers murmured words of support for the boy, while others filmed with their cell phones, perhaps to expose the injustice to the world. But the truth is that, at that moment, the boy was alone in his pain. How many times in life are we forced to swallow unfair situations because we have no choice? It's at these times that we learn that strength doesn't always lie in reacting in the moment, but in how we choose to get up afterwards. As he descended the stairs, the silence in the plane was deafening. The stewardess seemed satisfied with his decision, as if she had restored order. But little did she know that that moment would be the turning point, not just for the boy, but for everyone there. Sometimes it takes something deeply wrong for bigger truths to come to light, and this story was far from over. As the boy descended the stairs with slow steps and a heavy heart, the sound of a powerful engine echoed in the lane. A luxurious car with dark windows and an imposing presence parked next to the plane. From it stepped a tall, elegant man with a posture that exuded authority. It was the boy's father, who, on seeing him with his eyes watering and his backpack slung over one shoulder, wasted no time. He approached quickly and wrapped his son in a firm, protective embrace, as if to erase all the pain that moment had caused. That hug wasn't just a gesture of comfort. It was a silent declaration that no one should have to go through that, least of all his son. The man looked at the aircraft with determination and climbed the stairs with determined steps, making it clear that he was not there to ask for explanations, but to demand justice. How many times in life do we need to be that figure of strength for someone we love? Sometimes it is in the role of protector that we show the world that certain lines cannot be crossed. The passengers on the plane started whispering when they saw that man enter the cabin. There was something about his presence that completely changed the atmosphere. The stewardess, who until then had seemed unwavering in her authoritarian stance, took a step back when she realized who he was. Silence filled the room again, but this time it wasn't discomfort. It was anticipation of what was to come. The boy's father entered the cabin with a posture that left no doubt. He was there to right an injustice. His eyes, firm and penetrating, fixed on the stewardess who, for a moment, seemed to lose all the confidence she had shown before. Without raising his voice, but with an authority that filled the entire room, he revealed that he was the owner of the airline. The revelation dropped like a bombshell in the cabin, leaving everyone present in absolute silence. The stewardess, visibly disconcerted, tried to mumble something, but was interrupted. "Can you explain to me," he began, in a controlled tone, "why my son was treated this way?" His question was simple, but it carried a weight that made the air seem thicker. There was no room for empty excuses or weak justifications. He wasn't just there as a father. He was there as a leader who wouldn't tolerate disrespect within his own company. How many times in life are we confronted with situations where we need to take a stand not just for ourselves, but for something bigger? This was one of those moments. The passengers began to react almost instinctively. Some murmured words of support for the man. Others clapped their hands discreetly. It was as if everyone was waiting for someone who had the courage to face the situation head-on. The stewardess, now with no way out, began to realize that her actions would have consequences. But would she really understand the gravity of what she had done? The father knew that this was a lesson that needed to be taught, and he was willing to do it. As the boy's father confronted the stewardess, something unexpected began to happen. One by one, the passengers began to speak up. First, a man stood up and said indignantly that he had witnessed the injustice. Then a woman from across the aisle added that the stewardess' attitude was unacceptable. Within minutes, the awkward silence gave way to applause and words of support for the father and the boy. It was as if a flame had been lit, uniting those people around a greater purpose, fighting prejudice. Some passengers started recording videos with their cell phones, capturing every detail of that moment. It wasn't just about the boy or his father. It was about something much bigger. It was about showing that no one should be treated differently because of their appearance or circumstances. How many times in life do we see injustices and remain silent? The courage of one can inspire many, and on that plane, people were learning that in practice. The stewardess, now surrounded by disapproving stares, looked increasingly uncomfortable. She tried to keep her composure, but it was clear that she was shaken. The boy's father remained firm, without losing control of the situation. He knew that the passengers' support wasn't just for him or his son. It was a sign that people still believed in the power of justice and empathy. But would that be enough to change the stewardess' heart? That was a question that still hung in the air. Under the increasing pressure of the looks and words of support for the boy, the stewardess finally gave in. With a trembling voice and a visibly shaken face, she apologized to the boy. But her words, although said in a tone of regret, seemed empty, as if they were just an attempt to end the discomfort. The boy, still holding his backpack like a shield, looked at her without saying anything. He wasn't sure if those apologies were sincere or just the result of public embarrassment. The passengers who had previously applauded the father and the boy now watched the scene with a mixture of indignation and anticipation. Many wondered, would a simple apology be enough to erase what had happened? After all, the scars of public humiliation don't fade easily. How many times in life do we hear empty words that don't carry the genuine intention of change? True regret is not in the words, but in the actions that follow. The boy's father remained silent for a moment, analyzing every detail of the situation. He knew that the apology was only the first step and that there was still a lot to be done to right the wrong. His expression was firm, but his eyes conveyed something deeper, the conviction that this was an opportunity to teach a valuable lesson, not just to the stewardess, but to everyone present. The story was still far from over. The silence that hung in the cabin was broken by the firm voice of the father, who decided to turn that moment into a lesson. He looked directly at the stewardess and with clear, non-aggressive words, explained that respect is non-negotiable. No matter who we are or where we come from, we all deserve to be treated with dignity, he said, his voice echoing like a universal truth. He wasn't there just to defend his son, but to show that wrongs need to be righted with concrete actions, not just words. The passengers listened intently as he continued. He told them how his company had been built on values of equality and respect, and that attitudes like that went against everything he believed in. It's not about a uniform or a job title, he said, looking at the stewardess. It's about how we treat people when we think no one is looking. His words were like a mirror, reflecting not only her mistakes, but also the prejudices that many carry without realizing it. As he spoke, the boy watched his father with admiration. It was as if that moment was teaching him something greater, the importance of taking a firm stand, but also with empathy. The father concluded by saying that real change begins when we recognize our mistakes and commit to doing things differently. The stewardess bowed her head, visibly touched by his words. But would she be willing to turn that regret into something genuine? The next step was hers. After a moment of collective reflection, the father took the boy's hand and with a calm gesture led him back to his seat. He decided that he would fly alongside his son as a way of reaffirming that no one should feel alone in the face of injustice. The passengers who had followed every detail of the scene began to applaud spontaneously. It wasn't just a gesture of support. It was a show of respect for the firm and dignified stance of this man who had turned a moment of pain into a lesson for everyone. The boy sat by the window again, but this time with his father by his side. The backpack, which had once seemed like a shield against the world, now rested on the floor, as if the weight of the experience had been shared. He looked at his father and gave him a small smile, still shy, but full of gratitude. How many times in life do we need someone by our side to remind us of our worth? Sometimes it's the silent presence of someone who loves us that gives us the strength to go on. Meanwhile, the stewardess remained at the back of the plane, visibly shaken. She avoided crossing eyes with the passengers and seemed to be reflecting on everything that had happened. The atmosphere in the cabin began to change. The weight of the tension was replaced by an almost palpable lightness. But would that moment be enough to transform not only her attitude, but also the perceptions of everyone there? The flight would continue, but the lessons of that day were far from over. With his father at the boy's side, the atmosphere in the cabin began to change. The weight of tension that had previously hung over everyone gave way to a lighter atmosphere, almost as if that gesture of unity had dispelled the heavy clouds. The passengers who had previously been restless and indignant now exchanged glances of admiration and even discreet smiles. It was as if, in that small space, a collective lesson had been learned. The power of respect and empathy can change any environment. The boy, now calmer, looked out of the window as the plane began to taxi. He still felt the impact of what had happened, but his father's presence at his side was a reminder that he was not alone. How many times in life do we face difficult situations and are surprised by the support of those we least expect? Sometimes it's in the midst of chaos that we find the people who really make a difference. And there, at that moment, he knew that he not only had his father's support, but also that of many of the passengers. The stewardess, meanwhile, remained at the back of the aircraft, visibly uncomfortable. She avoided crossing eyes with the passengers and seemed immersed in her own thoughts. Perhaps she was beginning to understand the impact of her actions and the consequences that would follow. But would she really learn anything from all this? The flight had only just begun, and there was plenty of time for new thoughts to emerge both for her and for everyone else present. As the plane gained altitude and the world outside became a tapestry of clouds, the boy turned to his father, still with an expression of doubt on his face. "Has she really learned anything?" he asked, his voice low, but laden with curiosity and a touch of sadness. The father, with his usual calm, looked at his son and replied, "Sometimes people need to be confronted with the consequences of their actions in order to start changing. It's not up to us to decide for them, but we can show them the way." This conversation between father and son wasn't just about the stewardess. It was a reflection on life. How often do we wonder if our efforts to teach someone something have really had an effect? The father explained that real change begins within, and that, although they couldn't control the stewardess's choices, they could choose how to react to the situation. "What matters," he said, "is that you never let anyone make you feel smaller than you are. The way you see yourself is always more important than how others see you." Meanwhile, in the back of the plane, the stewardess seemed lost in her own thoughts. She looked out of the small window of the service cabin, perhaps reflecting on everything that had happened. The passengers were silent or talking in whispers, but there was a different energy in the air, a feeling that this flight was not just a physical journey, but also an emotional and moral one for everyone there. The final destination was approaching, but the lessons of that day were still being written. When the plane finally landed, the atmosphere in the cabin was one of expectation. The boy looked out of the window and saw that in the terminal, a group of airline executives were waiting near the landing stairs. His father, with his firm posture and determined look, knew that this moment would be crucial. He held his son's hand as they descended together, as if to make it clear that this story would not end without consequences. The boy, although still shaken, felt protected by his father's presence. The executives welcomed them with serious expressions, aware of the seriousness of the situation. The stewardess was called in for an immediate chat, and her nervousness was evident. She knew that her actions would not go unnoticed, and that she would have to face the consequences of her actions. How many times in life are we confronted with our mistakes so directly? It's in those moments that we are forced to decide whether to continue down the wrong path or start down a new one. Meanwhile, the passengers began to disembark, many of them still commenting on what had happened. Some approached the boy and his father to offer words of support or handshakes of solidarity. It was as if that experience had brought together people who had previously been just strangers on a random flight. But the question remained, would the stewardess really learn anything from all this? The answer was yet to come. After landing, the stewardess was called to meet the boy's father and the airline executives. This time, her words were not accompanied by arrogance or empty justifications. Visibly moved, she apologized again, but now with tears in her eyes. It was as if she had finally understood the weight of her actions. "I made a mistake," she said, her voice breaking. "And I promise I'll do whatever it takes to change." Her words carried a more genuine tone, but even so, the boy knew that only time could prove her sincerity. The boy, showing surprising maturity for his age, replied calmly, "I hope you really learned from this," he said, looking directly at her. There was no anger in his voice, just a silent hope that this experience could be transformative. How many times in life are we faced with people who have hurt us, and we need to find the strength to forgive? Not for them, but for ourselves, because carrying hurts only prevents us from moving forward. The executives watched in silence as the moment unfolded. The boy's father intervened only to reinforce that real change requires more than words, it requires commitment. He made it clear that the company would take steps to ensure that situations like this did not happen again. The stewardess nodded, still visibly shaken, but seemed determined to make a difference. This wasn't just an apology. It was the start of a journey of reflection and learning, both for her and for everyone involved. As father and son left the airport together, there was a sense of relief in the air. Not because everything had been resolved, but because they knew they had faced prejudice with courage and dignity. The father, his voice calm and full of wisdom, took advantage of the moment to share one last lesson with his son. "Respect, my boy," he said, "is not something you demand, but something you teach. And we teach by example, even when it's difficult." His words echoed as a reminder that the greatest battles are won with firmness and empathy. The boy looked at his father with admiration. He knew that day would be forever marked in his memory, not just by the pain of humiliation, but by the strength he found alongside the man he admired most. How many times in life are we challenged to stand firm in the face of adversity? And how often do the examples around us show us how to do this? That moment was more than a lesson in respect. It was a lesson in character and resilience. As they walked towards the car, the two exchanged a complicit smile. The boy knew that he still had a lot to learn about the world, but he also knew that he had someone by his side who was willing to guide him along that path. And there, under the open sky and away from the judgmental gazes of the plane cabin, father and son went on together, carrying not only a simple backpack, but also the certainty that they had turned a moment of pain into an opportunity for growth for them and for everyone else involved. This story shows us that life's greatest lessons often come from unexpected and uncomfortable situations. The boy, with his innocence and quiet strength, taught us that dignity is not to be negotiated, even when we are treated unfairly. The father, with his firm and compassionate stance, reminded us that respect is a two-way street. It is taught by example and reinforced by our actions. And the stewardess, with her mistakes and eventual regret, showed us that everyone has the capacity to change as long as they are willing to reflect on their attitudes. But what about you? How many times have you found yourself in a situation where you had to fight for what you believe in or defend someone who needed support? Have you been the example of respect and empathy that you would like to see in the world? This story is not just about a flight or an isolated incident. It is a mirror for our own lives. It challenges us to think, are we really treating others with the dignity they deserve? Are we willing to learn from our mistakes and grow as human beings? If this story has touched you in any way, be sure to share your thoughts. Subscribe to the channel and activate notifications to continue learning more about how we can turn challenges into opportunities for growth. After all, every day is a chance to do things differently and better.